So essentially what I do in the book is to offer a history of the Gulag largely by means of a local study. And that local study is in the Karaganda region of Kazakhstan. And so I'll just show you here quickly. If you look at this group of camps in this region, this was one of the largest and longest lasting Gulag camps was there, a camp called Karlag. It also had a number of other camps. It was an area that held a substantial population of internally exiled peoples. It was a region that hosted 4 of the very small number of special camps, a group of camps created in 1948, and camps that are dramatized in One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich. And it was a location that experienced one of the 3 major Gulag uprisings that occurred in the wake of Stalin's death. So all of this is to say that Karaganda experienced most of the major events and institutions of Gulag history, and thus provides us with a suitable vantage point from which to study the Gulag at ground level. The work starts in the early 1930s, and it ends in the late 1950s, essentially covering the period when the Gulag was at its largest. And it uses the approach of local history to avoid making the kind of chronological or topical limitations that might overly limit my ability to offer an overall interpretation of the Gulag's role in the Soviet Union. So the study proceeds from 3 basic points. These are not things that I discovered, but these were the starting points for me. One, the Gulag was a mass institution, and it was also a place of mass death. Best estimates we have in terms of population based on official documentation, 5.2 million was about the maximum population of the Gulag, including camps and exiled peoples, this in the early 1950s. Somewhere in the neighborhood of 18 million people passed through the camps of the Gulag, that is to say they were in the camps at one time or another, and another 6 or 7 million people were sent into exile into Siberia and Central Asia and the far north. And we believe that no fewer than 1.6 million people died in the camps of the Gulag during the Stalin era. And this does not count those who were executed prior to their arrival in camps, and it does not include deaths among the exile population, and these numbers are also in the millions. Now, these numbers are significantly smaller than we once thought, but they still bespeak a massive social institution where it's quite feasible to say that everybody knew somebody. The second point at which I start, and this is something that we learned after the archives opened and something we didn't know enough about, the Gulag was also a place of mass release. We know now that during the Stalin era, no fewer than 20% of the prisoner population was released every single year. So at least 115,000 inmates are released every year from the camps, and the number in some years reached well over 500,000. The third starting point is that the Gulag held more than just political prisoners. The Gulag was in fact the Soviet penal system, so the Gulag held the robbers, rapists, murderers, and thieves of the Soviet Union, but it also did hold political prisoners. And perhaps most numerous of all, it held the victims of arbitrary and draconian legal campaigns that met the pettiest of theft or showing up late for work with lengthy sentences in concentration camps. So Death and Redemption is the first book to take these factors into consideration to try to offer a fundamental reinterpretation of the role that the Gulag played in the Soviet Union. All of this then is my starting point to explore daily life in the Gulag. We know that the Soviet state had the know-how, it had the facilities, and it certainly had the will to violence to execute every one of the millions who passed through the Gulag. But they did not conceive of their concentration camp as a system of factories of death. If hundreds of thousands of Gulag inmates were released every year to return to Soviet society, we have 2 questions we have to ask to understand this system. First, how is it determined who is going to be released and who's going to die there? And second, what did they do to prepare inmates for reintegration into normal life? Now, in the Gulag, forced labor, high death rates, and an oppressive atmosphere of violence, cold, and constant hunger coexisted with camp newspapers and cultural activities, a constant propaganda barrage about things like correction and re-education, and the steady release of a significant portion of the prisoner population. Why did the Soviet authorities go to such tremendous lengths to maintain what Alexander Solzhenitsyn referred to as the farce of correction? And why is it that corrective practices endured in the camps from a prisoner's arrival until that prisoner's departure, whether that be dead or alive? Now, historians have largely interpreted the Gulag's role in Stalin's Soviet Union in one of three ways, or in some combination of these three ways. In the first, the Gulag is presented as an economic institution. It's primarily driven by the goal of extracting economic benefit from what amounted essentially to slave labor. Now, given what we have learned in recent years about the Gulag's economic inefficiency, given that arrests did not occur at the behest of Gulag administrators, who in fact were always scrambling to deal with what they understood as an oversupply of prisoners, and given that arrests were not limited to healthy adults of working age, given all these things, we simply cannot accept the explanation of the economic primacy of the Gulag's rise, even though economic output was one of the tasks assigned to the system. Now, the second line of interpretation, many others view the camps not as a means of economic exploitation, but primarily as a system of death camps designed to destroy all real or potential opposition to the Stalin regime. Given what we know about the extent of releases from the Gulag, we cannot accept the notion that the Gulag was merely a system of death camps, though, and I will emphasize, it was fully expected on the part of Soviet authorities that many would die there. And this is something they did not have a problem with. Though the focus of those camps on those seen as dangerous to the regime is quite appropriate, but all of this is something that needs a little further elaboration to try to understand it. Now, finally, in terms of these analyses, we come to Alexander Solzhenitsyn, the real founder of the field of Gulag studies, if there's such a field. And some, like Solzhenitsyn, see the Gulag as the ultimate expression of humanity's dark side, unleashed under the fig leaf of ideology. Now, as you'll find out, I also think ideology is important in trying to understand the Gulag, but in different ways. Ideology for Solzhenitsyn largely lacks content, lacks meaning. It is merely this fig leaf. I think rather that we have to understand the content and the meaning of the ideology to help us understand the way that this system operated. The Gulag cannot be understood and explained merely by references, though, to the tenets of Marxism or Bolshevism. It emerged as the concrete historical response to a number of contingent factors, including things like the Tsarist experience with forced labor, the late 19th century invention of the concentration camp, the crime and chaos of a period of revolution and civil war, and the attempt to rapidly industrialize a predominantly rural economy. But Bolshevik ideology was not just a facade. Bolshevik visions, Bolshevik ways of thinking about the world, visions of creating a perfect society, visions of struggle as the motive force of history, visions of enemies blocking the path to and contaminating utopia, visions of war with capitalist nations as inevitable, visions of labor as the defining feature of humanity and of criminality as something created by social conditions. All of these various aspects of the Bolshevik worldview combine with the particular historical circumstances to make the creation and the mass expansion of the Gulag possible. So what then are the key elements of Soviet ideology that help shape Gulag history? Fundamentally, we must remember that Bolsheviks believed that they were moving radically toward the end of history, toward the creation of utopia, of heaven on earth. The goal of their regime was of world historic importance. They were, however, constantly preoccupied with the question of how to get from an imperfect present to a perfect future. In this regard, we must then keep in mind two things. First, the Bolshevik worldview expected the presence of implacable enemies bent on destruction of the paradise they were building. And second, the Bolshevik worldview conceived of the individual human being as malleable, as a product of social background rather than genealogy. For the unreformable enemy, death was required. Of that there is no doubt. Nothing could get in the way of the radical desire to build socialism, but they were constantly left with this nagging question of what to make of the possibility for individual redemption. The camps then come to represent a crossroads for an individual, a final opportunity for enemies to prove that they could be molded into conscientious, enthusiastic supporters of the Soviet cause. And those viewed as failures in this re-education process were liquidated. In order to understand all of this, my book focuses on the institutions, on the identities, and on the practices of the Gulag to understand the factors that determine success in the prisoner's attempt to be one of those released instead of one of those liquidated. Today I'll spend a few minutes focusing on identities in the Gulag and on one particular set of identities to show how all of these things relate to death and to survival in the Gulag. Now, the Soviet regime expended tremendous energy in its effort to learn who its prisoners were. While the regime herded millions of people into the Gulag, often as members of mass collectives, it created a separate personal file on each prisoner held in the camps, in colonies, and in prisons. And it often kept individual files on exiles as well, though not as universally. In their effort to know their prisoners, Gulag authorities gathered several types of information which could be used for individual evaluation and for generalization and for categorization of the inmate population. Each individual file typically contained a number of things, and I looked through a lot of these prisoner files. It contained an identity questionnaire, contained a copy of the prisoner's conviction. Now, typically this would be a summary of the case if a court had been involved or if the secret police themselves had passed sentence. It would be just a mere short, two-line, this is the article they're convicted under and the length of their sentence. It included a number of prisoner evaluations, characteristici, and I'll come back to those in a bit. Often the file also contained copies of appeals of conviction and action taken on those appeals, information on disciplinary violations while in the camp, receipts for personal property brought to the camp, and release papers or, all too commonly, death certificates. Out of this information, Gulag officials at the central and local level created statistical generalizations about its prisoner population on a number of bases, in terms of gender, in terms of nationality or ethnicity, in terms of education level, category of crime supposedly committed, the length of sentence, health, labor utilization, this very Gulag term for prisoners working, fulfillment of labor norms, escapes, disciplinary violations, etc. Now these files, these individual prisoner files, accompany prisoners throughout their Gulag experience, and authorities reviewed these files repeatedly. During amnesties, during general release, during appeals, in all of these cases, they reviewed the files as the primary way of determining if a prisoner deserved to be released under this or that provision. In the prisoner files, the most important documents in many respects were these evaluations, these characteristici. They summed up in brief the prisoner's current camp identity and served to determine the prisoner's station in camp life. The files, almost without exception, showed significant care and time put into completing these evaluations. One of the common features of the modern state is the obsession with categorizing the members of its society. This categorization arises from and is integral to the modern political need to know the social body in order to transform it, and is evident in the emergence of things like the census, ethnographic expeditions, public health, surveillance, and other practices designed to provide information to the state about its population. The practice of categorization allows the modern state to simplify and represent a population too large to know on an individual basis. The practice combines the seemingly contradictory elements of individualization and generalization. Knowing every detail of individual citizens' life provides more data than even the modern state can use. Consequently, the state simplifies and generalizes certain elements of individual identity that it deems particularly important. The explicit and often implicit assumptions derived from an individual state's ideological assumptions shape the selection of the defining categories of generalization. At times, for example here, in the most obvious case, in the case of Jewish identity in the Nazi polity, a single category of identity can virtually trump and render moot all other categories. In other cases, states operated based on a complicated matrix of identities, not easily reduced to the one or two most significant categories of identity. Now, this process is both individualizing and de-individualizing. On the one hand, it leads to a certain leveling of individual differences among the state's population. On the other hand, the constant drive to subject every single citizen to this process of categorization forces the modern state to engage with each citizen individually. In the Soviet Union, this practice of categorization took on an especially political form. Whatever the specific criteria of categorization, they all related directly to the individual's perceived political reliability, and therefore to his or her chances for survival and for winding up in the Gulag. The practices of population cataloging existed in a particularly intense form inside the Gulag. Prisoners were constantly evaluated and categorized according to a matrix of identities based on who they were prior to their arrival in a Gulag camp. That is, things like the category of crime they had supposedly committed, their social class background, their nationality or ethnic group, their gender, whether they had served in the Red Army, these kinds of things. This, by the way, and these characteristica that I talk about, it's the top half of every one of these documents. They're also evaluated according to who they had become while in the Gulag, and that is to say on things like their labor performance, their political attitudes, their participation in camp cultural activities, their behavior or disciplinary violations, and all of these would mark the bottom half of these evaluations. In the Gulag, these categories operated together to form an intricate and ever-shifting hierarchy of redeemability that measured an individual's chances for re-education and thus for survival in the Gulag. The hierarchy bore tremendous similarities to the social hierarchies found in Soviet society at large. Furthermore, a corresponding and equally intricate hierarchy of institutions, including various types of prisons, concentration camps, and internal exile, developed with greater and lesser degrees of brutality, of isolation, and of state control, and to which individuals were assigned in accordance with those categories of identity. In addition, the practices of the Gulag, from things like the provision of food to the assignment of work, from the degree of isolation and the harshness of conditions, to decisions on early release or the leveling of new criminal charges prior to release, these practices were all differentiated in accord with those prisoner identities. Now, the power gap between camp authorities and individual prisoners was, of course, overwhelming. Nonetheless, identity in the Gulag was to some extent a two-way street. Prisoners shaped their own society in the Gulag, but interestingly, often using the same categories of identity favored by camp authorities themselves. While the Gulag authorities foisted distinct identities upon the camp population, the prisoners themselves played an important role in taking on and in giving shape to the emerging categories of identity. One's past, one's sentence, one's alleged crime, one's nationality or ethnic group. In short, the categories of one's identity, these were the admission tickets to the solidarity of prisoners, as surely as they conditioned the authorities' treatment of the prisoners. And the effectiveness of official categorization is only emphasized further by its utilization in prisoner relationships. Now, I want to make sure we're clear that this categorization is not a mere word game. In the Gulag, these categorizations had very real life and death consequences. And so what I want to do is talk just for a bit about one axis of that matrix of categorization, And in this case, I'll talk about the axis of political prisoners versus common criminals. Now, a couple of words about who political prisoners were in the Gulag. Well, first off, according to official Soviet terminology, there was no such thing as a political prisoner in the Gulag, because there could be no one who was suffering for the cause in the camps. So the terminology of choice was that these prisoners were counter-revolutionaries. And in a general sense, those that we understand as politicals, and I'll talk about some of the complications in a moment, but those we understand as politicals are those convicted under Article 58 of the Criminal Code of the Russian Federation, or and it's slightly different articles in the other republics of the Soviet Union. But this was the article that covered counter-revolutionary crimes. Now, being tagged with this category of counter-revolutionary had very real and sometimes quite lethal consequences for the Gulag prisoner. Nonetheless, Soviet justice used this term in a very malleable fashion. The provisions of Article 58 were so broad and so vague that a crime that was prosecuted under other articles of the criminal code today could be prosecuted under Article 58 tomorrow, or vice versa. Of course, individuals in the Soviet Union could easily find themselves arrested and charged as a counter-revolutionary for having committed no crime at all. The prevalence of arrests under Article 58 should not necessarily be taken as evidence of widespread counter-revolutionary activity or even of opposition to Soviet rule. But no matter how malleable the application of Article 58, those branded with the number were subjected to a much harsher Gulag regime. No matter the number of prisoners sentenced under Article 58, official documents and memoirs attest time and again to the importance of that category in the construction of Gulag identity. In general, the authorities treated these so-called counter-revolutionary prisoners with great suspicion. The redeemability of this group was questionable at best. They received the longest sentences. They were often excluded from practices of early release. They were most likely to serve their sentences in the extreme geographic locales of the Gulag. They were often excluded from working in their specialties and were subjected to the harshest forms of labor. Time and again, then, being a counter-revolutionary in the Gulag meant that it would be much more difficult to survive the Gulag experience. Now, of course, the exclusion of these Article 58 prisoners in practice never quite reached that imagined in official policy. Regulations officially prohibited 58s from holding privileged positions in the camps. But the predominance of engineers and other specialists among the political prisoner population ultimately overran this official proclamation. Although the 58s were supposed to have only limited exposure to the cultural activities of the camp, we have probably all read many a memoir, and Solzhenitsyn himself, who described participating in various cultural activities. In Solzhenitsyn's case, he participated in amateur theatricals in the camps. Furthermore, while their capacity for redemption was questionable, the counter-revolutionary criminal who had survived to reach the camps of the Gulag, and this is an important distinction, was not considered hopelessly irredeemable. If he were, he would have been executed, as so many, in fact, were. Now, the opposite side of the authorities' innate but not inflexible distrust of what they called the socially harmful, these counter-revolutionaries, right, was their fundamental belief in the reformability of those they called socially friendly, that is, the common criminal. This vision of criminal reformability derived directly from the Bolshevik worldview. Common criminals, it was reasoned, arose only in response to the devaluation of labor under repressive capitalist control. As a result of and as part of what official documentation would describe as the beautification or the socialization of the camp society, the criminal would become to be recognized, the criminal would, and this is sort of the theoretical idea, right? The criminal would come to recognize the value of work and would therefore be redeemed. The construction of a sharp boundary by authorities between the Article 58 prisoners, the counter-revolutionaries, and these common criminals served to focus the self-representation of these so-called socially friendly on the negative portrait of those socially harmful. By revealing to thieves a picture of those who were less redeemable, their own redeemability was affirmed. And in accordance with this level of trust, camp authorities were authorized to take prisoners sentenced for non-counter-revolutionary crimes and exhibiting exemplary behavior in camp into a wide array of positions within the camp, including administrative positions and even serving as armed guards for the camps themselves, prisoners serving as guards. While the authorities ascribed a very negative but malleable connotation to this term counter-revolutionary, the educated prisoners, largely from among the ranks of political prisoners and those who have left us most of the memoir evidence about the Gulag, uses the same categories, but they reverse the hierarchy. And they draw an even sharper distinction between what for them are not counter-revolutionaries and the socially friendly, but are what are politicals and thieves. These self-styled politicals then counterpose their identity to that of the common criminal, uniformly writing about consistent and continuous victimization of the politicals by the criminals. Furthermore, they assert that this victimization was carried out at the behest of, or at least with the acquiescence of, camp authorities themselves. You can see how this comes, right? When they're allowing these guys to serve as guards, that you understand it in this way. Of all the tales of torture and privation that fill Solzhenitsyn's multi-volume work, Gulag Archipelago, he seems most offended by the loss of the privileged position of the political prisoner and the perceived coddling of thieves. More than any other memoirist, he draws the picture of these two groups in garish terms. Politicals were, quote, guilty of nothing, and they were, quote, unprepared to put up any resistance. He calls them submissive sheep at the hands of the wolf. On the other hand, the tattooed chests, he writes, these being the criminals, were merely the rear ends of the blue caps being the Gulag guards. He also writes, "You'll not get fruit from a stone nor good from a thief." He accuses these, what he calls parasites, of being unwilling to work, of entering the war only to pillage the occupied territories, of illiteracy, and of indifference to written literature. Solzhenitsyn denies a distinction between honest thieves and what were called the bitches. Typically, the former, the distinction is typically understood as this: the former are those who refuse to cooperate with camp authorities, while the latter are those who did. Solzhenitsyn was also in no sense alone in his extreme characterizations of the criminal element. And I'll throw out just one quote from another of the most well-known memoirists, Yevgenia Ginsburg, who declared that, quote, "The professional criminals are beyond the bounds of humanity." Now, other memoirists attribute their successful survival at various points to their capacity to come to some accommodation with criminal elements in the camp. Janusz Bardach frequently befriended criminal elements by serving as their storyteller. He entertained them with tales he derived from books he had read and stories that he knew. Furthermore, he gained a mastery of the crudities of the criminal language. And when he used this language, it distinguished him from what the criminals, he says, called the mama's boys, and allowed him to be more at ease with his criminal companions. Through his friendships with criminal elements, Bardach earned their protection from attacks by other criminals and gained access to additional and, of course, often stolen food, space, clothing, and other material items, which allowed him to maintain his bodily strength and is one of the many explanatory factors for his survival. Professional criminals, that is, those who formally or informally associated themselves with the criminal gangs of the Gulag, marked their own identities in a number of specific ways. First, and probably most famously, they tattooed their bodies, offering visual evidence of their identity. Yet the professional criminals also identified themselves through participation in an elaborate Gulag criminal subculture, a subculture that Soviet officials battled unsuccessfully to destroy. They played cards, they sang bawdy songs, they listened to stories, they swore. Their language was notorious for its vulgarity. The violence that they committed was notorious. At the same time, vast numbers of Soviet citizens were arrested for offenses that were not political in nature, but were so minor that it would be quite difficult to understand them as criminals. So the peasant who was arrested for taking a few potatoes from a field during a famine, or the worker who came afoul of harsh labor laws that threatened criminal punishment for tardiness to work or for leaving a job without permission. In many ways, I think we have to understand these prisoners as yet a third category, not politicals and not these professional criminals. They're sometimes referred to in the Gulag as buiteviki, or those who committed everyday life crimes, petty crimes. Now, the political prisoner common criminal axis of identity was only one of many that operated in the Gulag. And it changes a lot over the course of time from the early 30s to the late 50s. Nonetheless, it was accorded tremendous importance by both prisoners and authorities. It shifted in the war and post-war eras. It was increasingly displaced by the importance of national identity or ethnic identity in the camps, particularly with the annexation of the western borderlands and the Stalin-Hitler Pact of 1939. Nonetheless, national identity was already assuming significant prominence in the Gulag prior to 1939, and this is, just another of those axes that one can follow, and one can see how it relates to one's capacity for survival. In the end, the Gulag served both as a tool to reform those who could be reformed, but also as a place to define who could and who could not be reformed. The Gulag was an imprecise, crude tool for the transformation of society. In the Gulag, society's filth, right, and this is the kind of language that the Soviets would use, subjected to the harshest conditions, would either be purified and returned to society or cast out finally through death. And in the Soviet worldview, I want to emphasize again the coexistence of violence and transformation, of creation and destruction, of death and redemption, was no contradiction. In fact, one was unimaginable without the other. Many would no doubt die in the process of transforming society and transforming its inmates through the Gulag, but socialism, they understood, was built in the midst of class war, and casualties were seen as inevitable. So these are the principal questions that drive and emerge from my study of the Gulag on the ground. I focus on how these institutions, identities, and practices shifted throughout Gulag history. And I want to end just talking to you very briefly about one of the more remarkable images I found. A propaganda graveyard in a camp zone. And it's titled Mogila Filonov. Now, Filon is a Gulag slang term that stands for, it's an acronym, stands for False Invalids of the Camps of Special Designation. Now, you'll see here in this graveyard a number of markers. Mavlanov, 22%, Gaziev, 30%, Razorny, 42%. And what they were saying with this graveyard and this use of percentages is that those who failed to fulfill their work norms in the camps would die there. And the reason that I show you this is to emphasize once again that death was not a problem for them, for Gulag authorities. They expected it, and they were not ashamed to use it to try to convince their prisoners to work harder, to live differently. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We're very lucky to have with us today Karl Berkhoff, who is the Morris C. Shapiro Senior Scholar in Residence at the United States Holocaust Museum, a memorial museum across the mall. He's regularly the Associate Professor at the Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies at the Royal Netherlands Academy of the Arts and Sciences. He holds a PhD in history at the University of Toronto and 2 doctorandus degrees in Russian studies and history from the University of Amsterdam. He is the author of Harvest of Despair, Life and Death in Ukraine Under Nazi Rule, and has been working on a monograph detailing Soviet home front propaganda from 1941 to 1945. His publications include articles on the portrayal of the Holocaust in Soviet media during World War II, the Babi Yar massacre, and the Ukrainian nationalist sentiments toward Germans and Jews in the early 1940s. His works have been featured in renowned scholarly journals such as Kritika Explorations in Russian and Eurasian History and Harvard Ukrainian Studies. We're very happy to have you today to act as discussant, so I'll give you the floor.
Thank you for inviting me. Can everybody hear me? Okay, I will start with my conclusion. Death and Redemption is a book that any person wishing to understand the Gulag must read. Stephen Barnes defines the Gulag as follows. It is the entire Soviet forced labor detention system. It comprised not just the notorious corrective labor camps, there were also the special settlers, there were the corrective labor colonies, and there were sites for prisoners deemed highly dangerous, initially certain divisions within camps and later special camps. And Stephen Barnes notes accurately, the Gulag was not confined to a distant region. For example, it followed the Red Army westward during the Second World War. The book has 3 chapters about the 1930s, 1 about the Second World War, and 2 about the post-war period. It focuses on Gulag, a large agricultural corrective labor camp in the steppe of the Karaganda region in Kazakhstan. But it conceptualizes this camp beautifully within the Gulag as a whole. I noticed that German studies or sources are not used, such as a general history and a study of the very same camp by Wladislaw Hedler and Meinhard Stark. But I hasten to add that even if Barnes had employed these books, I don't think he would have had to change much, or even to acknowledge a precedent for his key point. As he said himself, in general, earlier studies in any language have emphasized one of 3 elements: morality, the Gulag as a triumph of evil; politics, the Gulag as a means of destroying opponents; or economics, the Gulag as a system of slave labor. For example, that's the point emphasized in the well-known book by Anne Applebaum. One point this book makes very forcefully is that the Gulag did not intend to kill. And, by the way, it also says that there was no intent to destroy non-Russian communities that had been deported. For example, in the Karaganda region, the deported nationalities were not dispersed among existing populations of other nationalities. Barnes's main statements deal with the Sovietizations of the prisoners and with changes in the Gulag system over time. First, the Gulag was a Soviet institution in the sense that imprisonment there did not completely marginalize the person from Soviet society. The Gulag, as he just said, was not just a site of violence. It was also meant to reform, to redeem for Soviet society. In terms that perhaps might offend some Gulag survivors, Barnes writes that the regime conceived of the Gulag as a chance, as a last chance. Prisoners who would not die were supposed to be mentally transformed and returned to society. That's why the extensive indoctrination network that existed in Soviet society was replicated at great expense in the Gulag. But this re-education was never intended to be easy. Brutality, I'm quoting here, was itself part and parcel of the ideology of labor in the Gulag. Labor was not only the means, but also the measure of rehabilitation, and failure in the re-education process was meant to be fatal. Here I was reminded of the work of Orlando Patterson, who coined the concept of social death of slaves. Patterson, in this concept, meant 3 components: subjection to an inferior status, exclusion from the legitimate social or moral community, and relegation to a perpetual state of dishonor. This book makes amply clear that in the Gulag none of this applied. These people were not socially dead. The Second World War gets a good amount of attention. During the war, Barnes writes, the Gulag, the institution that symbolized Soviet mobilization, actually hardly contributed to that most intense Soviet mobilization effort. If the war was won through economic production, and that's only an if, the book argues it did so despite the Gulag. Moscow considered the contribution made by the Gulag to military production as secondary. More important was its role in the battle to cleanse and shape the Soviet home front. Even during the war, as before, the authorities made a strong effort to recreate Soviet society within the Gulag. In short, even at a time of profound crisis, it remained an ideological institution. After the war, important changes were made, and this contradicts a view widely held, for example, by Anne Applebaum, that the Gulag had assumed its end state in the late 1930s. In fact, after the war, the Gulag became more extreme, both in terms of population and in the brutalities committed there. There arrived new detention sites, for example, prisoners of war camps, filtration camps to screen Soviet citizens who had undergone Nazi rule, special divisions, katorga, for particularly dangerous prisoners. Actually, Solzhenitsyn called these divisions murder camps. And from 1948, special camps. In addition, also the following happened. The regime began to focus on ethnicity, or in Soviet terminology, nationality. This actually went against the grain of the trend that Barnes noted for the Gulag in general. All those years of treating the punished people in the camps as at least partly redeemable. In 1948, the exile of the deported nationalities was made permanent. How does Barnes explain the special camps, so harsh, and the perpetuity of the exile? He refers here to external events, for example, the fight against Ukrainian and Baltic partisans. Secondly, to the long-term Soviet drive to sort its population into ever finer categories. And with the special camps, he adds that they were meant to intimidate the other prisoners. If you don't behave, you will be sent to those stronger, more severe camps. I find the book also very original in making very clear that on the eve of Stalin's death in 1953, the Gulag was not in any crisis. In fact, Barnes argues that in some ways the Gulag was more efficient than ever. Deaths and escapes were at a historically low level, despite the increased numbers of prisoners and exiles. In fact, it is remarkable how little uprisings and mass resistance there had been. So Stalin's death really becomes crucial, and that followed several years of increasing disobedience and what Barnes calls almost total collapse. After these uprisings, most prisoners sentenced for counter-revolutionary crimes were released. Suddenly, they were no longer the least redeemable and the most dangerous. The authorities began to focus on criminal gangs, and that is perhaps the biggest change in the system after Stalin. I've expressed a few reservations and I will pose some questions, but I wish to emphasize that this is a brilliant book. The reader is not as horrified as may be the case upon reading other books about the Gulag, but instead one gets here, finally, 20 years after the end of Soviet communist rule and so many years after Stalin died, we get a sense that we are finally beginning to make some sense of it all. I really hope that a Russian edition will appear, for not only we in the West, but Russia and its neighbors badly need it. So I have a few points. One deals with comparison. This book makes no attempt to compare with Nazi camps. I take this actually positively. It is a sign that there is now a field of Gulag studies. In fact, there is a journal with this title. Still, in some places I would have been curious to get some sense of comparison. For example, Barnes makes much of the music that greeted incoming camp inmates. He sees it as part of the Sovietization project. The main Nazi concentration camps had official orchestras, and even some of the Nazi death camps had them. The music was there for cynical reasons. It was background music for incoming and outgoing work commandos, and for staged executions. The website Music and the Holocaust even refers to the concept of sonic torture. My point is simply that music can also be interpreted in this way. So my question is, was Soviet music in these places never cynical, indeed, as the book states, and with which, by the way, I am tempted to agree? A second question. What does forced labor mean when it took place outside of the camps? I'm referring to a couple of phenomena that perhaps are very relevant here. In the fall of 1940, teenagers began to be conscripted for the so-called labor reserves. In fact, it seemed to be forced labor. Almost 1 million were called up for trade or factory training schools. The state simply removed the teenagers from their parents and placed them in barracks. It assigned them for a couple of years to factories, mines, building projects, and railroads. Their work was preceded by an early call and by military drills. What does that mean for your narrative? In addition, during the Second World War, virtually all the citizens were mobilized into some kind of forced labor. They had to work, they had no say about where and how long. In April of 1942, for example, the city mobilized all city dwellers and non-peasants who lived in villages. In addition, there was so-called trudovaya povinnost, labor duty, of a certain limited duration. People were outsourced from work they already had, and they faced military tribunals if they shirked it. So overall, my question is that part of the Gulag, or is it something outside of it? Or maybe there's a third possible answer. My final question, and I have a tiny one which I perhaps will leave out now, so as to leave time for the rest. What about the camps of the prisoners of war, Germans and so on? I found little about them in your... that's interesting. I'm just curious, are they not really relevant for the argument in the sense that these are foreigners in principle who are in the same system, and is their presence somehow revealing of the way in which the regime thought and conceived of the Gulag? But I will stop here. I want to add just one more sentence. I admire this book really very much, so I urge you to buy it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Do you want to respond to some
Whatever.
Why don't you
think is
respond to
best.
some of those questions while our audience thinks
Okay.
of questions?
You want me to go? Oh, sorry, I misunderstood. Yes, okay. Thank you, Carl. I hope that one still winds up with the sense that it's a very frightful place after reading the book. I titled it Death and Redemption for a reason. I think to understand the camps, you have to understand both the mass death that did take place and that was expected to take place. Even if it wasn't exactly intended, it was certainly expected. But you also have to then take account of the fact that so many were released and try to understand that factor. On your question, just a couple of things. On the Nazi-Soviet comparison, an earlier version of the manuscript had an epilogue that specifically dealt with this at quite some length. After a lot of thinking and some pretty rough reports from readers, from the press, I decided to remove it, and I may come back to it in article form at a later date. I've also given some thought to writing a broader book about the history of concentration camps, in which case it wouldn't deal with just the Nazis and the Soviets, but of course all kinds of examples. But in many respects, the Nazi comparison is implicit throughout the book, which is to say that it is in part an understanding of the operation of factories of death in Nazi Germany that helped me to understand that the Gulag was something different. So millions died in the Gulag, no question about it, and it's a horrible human tragedy and a horrible crime against humanity. But it was something a little bit different, and it has to be understood a little bit differently. And you have to understand that the book deals with people once they arrive in a camp. So this is after, executions have taken place, and we know the Soviet state executed, hundreds of thousands, if not millions, directly with a bullet in the back of the head. On the question of music in particular, I don't think I would say that Soviet music was never cynical, because I don't think I would ever say that this entire educational apparatus was never cynical. In fact, it was often quite cynically treated, particularly at the level of a local camp commander, and even more so for those who were subordinate to him. So you find, camp employees taking paper that was sent that was supposed to be turned into camp newspapers, and they're using it to roll cigarettes, this paper, because paper was in short supply. And what's not to be cynical about for them? They're constantly being met with mixed messages, right? I mean, these are the most dangerous people. If any one of them escapes, it could do irreparable harm to the Soviet state and to the Soviet Union. But at the same time, you're supposed to re-educate these people. And I think the cynical response is quite understandable. And I understand Gulag employees in a situation in which they're constantly being met by seemingly conflicting demands from above. And they have to kind of try to figure out what they want to do so that they're less likely to be punished. Oftentimes the demands of the Gulag as a penal institution and the demands of the Gulag as an economic institution clashed with one another. So what would you get in more trouble for? For example, just one thing here, right? You'll get in much more trouble for escapes than you ever will for deaths. So there's very little complaint. I mean, there's some in the documentation, but very little complaint about too many deaths in a camp. But my goodness, if your escape number goes up, you may well be criminally charged yourself. So this relates a lot to how these camp employees dealt with their jobs. In terms of this question of forced labor outside of the camps, I think we have to understand that the entire Soviet Union in the Stalin era operated according to a hierarchy of detention. And its most extreme locales were sure in what we properly understand as the Gulag, but as you mentioned, everyone was in a sense detained. They weren't free to move about, and some were more detained than others, right? I mean, you go from the people in the special camps who are the most strictly isolated, to people in regular camps, to people in labor colonies, to the exiled population, to peasants without passports, internal passports to travel around inside the country. I mean, they're detained. And of course, labor was always forced. I mean, it was a requirement. You could be criminally charged if you weren't working. And you could be criminally charged for leaving your job without permission. In terms of the prisoner of war camps, I've thought a lot about them. To be honest, I'm not sure how to answer the question. I'm not sure how they fit. You will see certain things that make you think that maybe it fits in the system, where there'll be declarations about making these German prisoners familiar with the Socialist Organization of Labor and stuff like this. And but it is to a significant degree a system apart, even while it geographically sometimes sat in the very same locations. In fact, part of Gulag was turned into a POW camp for a while. So, I'll stop there. But I really want it to be clear that there are these two sides to this, and that brutality is very much a part of the way that this place worked, and it was intended to be so.
We have a hand here. Please wait for the microphone to come. Just right there. Yeah. And also introduce yourself for the benefit of our speakers. So we'll take your question and then, yeah.
My name is Stephen Shore. I have two basic kinds of brief questions. The first is the relationship between psychosis and cynicism. That is, in terms of the organizing principle of the Gulag, to what extent was these based on psychotic concepts sincerely held, and the other would be it's reciprocal, that the sincerity was never there from the start, and it's, if you posited that redemption in any sense was a goal, then why was there any follow-up on former prisoners once they left the Gulag to see if in fact they had been allegedly redeemed? Or was this never sincerely believed from the start, and with the goal of arbitrary terror to have more consequences for those never contained within the Gulag than for those actually contained? And my second question is, the impression I have, I mean, it's the temptation to compare it with German camps operating in much of the same time period is irresistible. But my impression, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that the German system was far less arbitrary. That is, if you were not politically active and not in various categories of Untermenschen, you were not likely to be seized by the Gestapo or sent to the Konzentrationslager. That you could stay clear of politics and be Aryan and essentially be left in peace. So is this basically true, or is it more complex than that?
My name is Boris Lanin. I am Woodrow Wilson Center Fellow. First, I would agree that Gulag wasn't a death factory. But, in fact, it was. It wasn't planned as death factory, but in fact it became death factory. What was the turning point? I always thought that the turning point was the decision never release the prisoners. Because in 30s they could come back home, but never in 40s or in 50s. Or probably I don't know about that. And the second, well, I understand what do you mean when you ask about cynical music, but usually cynicism refers to text. Is it verbal text or text compiled with gesture? But how to define is music, well, noble or cynic or whatever? What do you mean in this case? Or the very fact that somebody plays in this case? Thank you.
And Will, we'll take your question too.
Will Pomerantz, Deputy Director of the Kennan Institute. My question, Steve, is for just to learn a little bit more about the people who are filling out these evaluations. Obviously, you kind of get the impression of these camps of being kind of on the outskirts, of not being kind of well manned and so forth, yet what you're describing is somehow a very strong bureaucratic machine that's consistently filling out these forms and are actually taking into and doing it seriously as opposed to kind of checking boxes. So to what extent, who is filling out these evaluations, and to what extent are they actually kind of, or do they talk to the prisoners, or do they just kind of checking boxes arbitrarily?
Okay, we'll take one last question.
Trudy Peterson, let me follow right on to that. You said you read a lot of the prisoner files. When the Soviet Union broke up, did they leave these in Kazakhstan, and if so, under whose control are they, and how accessible are they?
Okay. A lot of really great questions. Let me start actually with your final question on these prisoner files. Typically, and you know, this is largely, I have to say, based on my experience working in Kazakhstan, so I don't know for sure in other places, but typically what I found is that if a prisoner's last place of imprisonment was in Karaganda, their file is still in Karaganda. If they left, the file is not there, so it has gone with them somewhere else. For example, Alexander Solzhenitsyn himself was imprisoned in that region. His file is not there. The files are currently under the control of, and it's a horrendously long name, but it's the Archival Department of the Center for Legal Statistics and Information under the Procuracy of Karaganda Region. They hold not only these prisoner files, but the entire administrative archive of Karlog, of Steplog, of these camps in this region. They have never been declassified in Kazakhstan, or at least had not as of when I was there working with them. But the director of this center, with the long name, was a very liberal sort of gentleman who thought this information should be known and felt that he had the personal authority to grant access to these materials. Are they still available today? I don't know. I mean, this is the thing. They've never been declassified, so presumably a different director of the same center could mean that they're no longer accessible to anybody. Will, on your question about these people filling out evaluations, this is something I'll fully admit I don't know enough about. We don't know enough about Gulag employees and their lives and their motivations. And in Moscow, the Central Gulag Administrative Archive is divided into 9 sections. 2 of them are still classified. You cannot see them. One is the operation of the internal surveillance system inside the camps, informants and things of this sort. The other is the personnel files. You can't look at them. And until we can look at them, I mean, I think we still have a lot to know. So were they just checking boxes when they filled these things out? Yeah, possibly. Were people taking bribes to fill them out in certain ways? Definitely possible. But what I do know and what I can tell is that they did look at these things. So during the 1930s, for example, there was a practice which is zachot rabochik dnei, so counted working days or something like this for translation. But essentially what it was is that, if you fulfilled 100% of your labor today might count a day and a half toward the completion of your sentence. And if you fulfilled 150%, it would count even more. And, the precise numbers of all this change from time to time, but they're very, in great detail documenting all of this and calculating the date of somebody's release. And in fact, you can find files where these people were released in accordance with all of this material. How cynical they were, or how whether they were just filling out boxes, I don't know. But it had real impact. Of that, there is no doubt. Okay, on the question about the German system, I feel a little bit like you read my epilogue that doesn't appear. And it's, by the way, it's in my dissertation, which you can still get access to from Stanford. It's a point that I make, but that I was not original in making this point about the German system being less arbitrary, and I think it was less arbitrary. I feel like the flip side of social malleability, right? The notion that somebody who is evil can become good is that somebody who is good can become evil. And that's precisely the difficulty of it. So you could never feel secure, no matter what position you were in, right? In the Soviet Union. I mean, Molotov's wife is picked up and, sent off to exile. So
that's only supposed to have said, "Don't worry, we'll get you a new wife."
Right, exactly. In terms of sincerity of what's going on there, I mean, it is a really difficult question, and I have, I think the question about follow-up on former prisoners is critical, and I think one of the big holes that I understand it in my argument, and something that I would expect to find according to the way that I describe this system, is that there should have been studies of recidivism rates from various camps, right? I mean, what camp's doing better and what camp's doing worse? Never seen anything like this. However, what is clear is that if you are a recidivist, if you're somebody who has committed a crime more than once, well, that's another axis of identity. And it's another thing that's going to make it much more difficult for you to get out the second time. And you're going to be subjected to much harsher conditions. And so, and this stuff is very real. So, big amnesties that happen in different points in Gulag history, and recidivists are typically excluded, as are counter-revolutionaries, political prisoners. They're typically excluded. And this is why these things have such real life and death impacts. In terms of this issue of a decision to never release prisoners, there in fact never was such a decision, and prisoners are being released every single year. From 1934 to 1953, it's never less than 115,000 people who are getting out. And this is one of the things that I think we always have to take account of. Now, we have to understand who it is that's being released. And this is a lot of what I'm trying to do, is I'm trying to show that if you are a political, it's much harder to be among those released, right? Because your sentence is more likely to be 10 years or 25 years after the war, a lot of these sentences. It should be, I should point out, though, that release was never total. And the stain of having been convicted of a crime never goes away. So we find, for example, in the Great Terror of 37 and 38, a lot of the people that they round up are people who had been in camps and were released. And they're then picked up in 37 and 38 during the terror. We also find that political prisoners are often released with certain restrictions on where they can live. They can't live in the largest cities. They can't live within 100 kilometers of the largest cities. They can't live within 100 kilometers of the border of the Soviet Union. After the war in 1948, with the creation of these special camps, those who were, and this is a subset of the politicals, those considered the worst of the worst, they're not really released at all. They're released, but they're released into exile, permanent exile. And so, I think we have to keep all of that in mind.
Some more hands on the other side. Yeah, we'll take those two questions.
Natalia Klivalina, canon scholar. In the memoirs of the Gulag survivors, in many of them, they wrote about the comparison between the Gulag system and all Soviet system. They wrote that maybe we are lucky that we are here because we are not afraid anymore. What do you think about that comparison? I mean that Gulag was the little concentrated model of all Soviet system. Thank you.
And we'll take a question from the gentleman next to you. Yeah.
Yes, just to add the discussion about the records, I do know someone who, in 1937, his father was taken away. He happens to be the son of Frida Utley, who you probably know was very famous during the 40s. And as being a British citizen living in Moscow, they were secretly able to leave, and he eventually came to this country and grew up here. And about